Paris Peace Accords was a meeting between the three powers of the Vietnam War: South Vietnam, with America on one side of the conflict, and North Vietnam on the other. Despite the Paris Peace Accords having made strides in resolving the Vietnam conflict in 1973, war soon returned to the peninsula and conflict at home. Politicians clashed over whether to aid their democratic counterpart in Indochina, as it was overrun by the Viet Cong, leading to the nation's collapse on April 30th, 1975. The Vietnam War stretched across 20 years and 4 U.S. presidents. From November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975, U.S. bombings and Viet Cong guerrilla warfare caused over 627,000 civilian deaths in North and South Vietnam. In the end, the U.S. withdrew and the Communist government of the North took control of the country. The domino theory is what drove the U.S. to assist the South Vietnamese. This theory stated that if one country in Asia revolted in the name of communism and succeeded, the rest would follow like a row of dominoes. The U.S. viewed the conflict as a fight against communism. On the other hand, North Vietnam saw what they call the resistance war against America as a fight for freedom and independence. This is what was broken about the United States Vietnam policy. The U.S. was introduced to the conflict in 1955 under President Eisenhower. Military advisors were sent to Saigon, modern-day Ho Chi Minh City, to train soldiers in the democratic South. U.S. troops would not fight in the war until 1964, when the Gulf of Tonkin incident and naval engagement between the North Vietnamese and the U.S. gave Congress the excuse they needed to call for war. The U.S. would continue to fight the North Vietnamese alongside the South. Understanding public opinion on the war is also very important to understanding why it failed. A major reason for the public outcry against the war was the draft policies. Veteran Staff Sergeant Steve Hasna, who served for 3 years in Vietnam, expressed this when he said, "The rich used college deferments to protect their kids at the same time supporting the war. That's not right or fair." Despite joining the war just a year earlier, the U.S. was attempting to spark peace talks with North Vietnam as early as 1965. However, because of conflicting interests, no negotiations were initiated. In 1968, President Johnson halting Operation Rolling Thunder almost brought all parties to the negotiating table, but fighting continued. In August of 1965, Richard Nixon dispatched Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, to negotiate peace with Le Duc Tho, a North Vietnamese diplomat. After just over 4 years, on October 8, 1972, Le Duc Tho and Henry Kissinger reached an agreement to end the conflict. Because of the threat of the U.S. going over their heads and talking with the Russians and Chinese, the South opened up to peace talks. This led Kissinger announcing the draft of the treaty later that month. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords was signed by representatives from South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the United States. The agreement called for a total withdrawal from South Vietnam of troops, military advisors, and military personnel. It also stated that the reunification process of the countries should be done peacefully and by the will of the people. The two countries were to be recognized as sovereign nations, and all prisoners of war were to be returned. Most important, the document set up a ceasefire between South Vietnam and North Vietnam. Despite this, both North and South Vietnam began fighting again. On April 30th, 1975, South Vietnam surrendered. The country was annexed by North Vietnam, and to this day, Communist Vietnam reigned supreme. The peace agreement had failed. The American people were done with Vietnam at this point. However, many politicians still wanted to support Vietnam through funding. For the last 2 years of its existence, many lawmakers would push for increased funding to South Vietnam. The largest of these examples was President Nixon's request for Congress to raise funding to South Vietnam by $1.5 billion, according to Mr. Hughes, the editor of the Nixon tapes. This continued after Nixon's resignation with President Ford. He also argued for increased funding for South Vietnam in his 1975 address to Congress, stating, "The chances for an enduring peace after the last American fighting man left Vietnam in 1973 rested on two publicly stated premises. First, that if necessary, the United States would help sustain the terms of the Paris Peace Accords it signed 2 years ago, and second, that the United States would provide adequate economic and military assistance to South Vietnam." However, despite their efforts, the $700 million of annual aid was not raised from 1973 to 1975. The argument these two presidents had was that with the funding, South Vietnam would ensure its independence. However, the American people had seen what had happened before and wanted to stay out. This mindset was shown by Vietnam veteran Alfredo Lange when he told us, "No war is worth it. Too many lives are impacted." He served as a corporal in the U.S. Army from 1966 to 1960. In the final weeks of the Vietnam War, military personnel, urban educated professionals, and those who helped the South Vietnamese government were evacuated by the U.S. due to being targeted by communist forces. Many were forced to stay in refugee camps in the Philippines and Guam for months before being able to arrive at the U.S. When South Vietnam was annexed by the North in April of 1975, the second wave of refugees fled. This second wave of refugees consisted of much more commoners compared to the generals and politicians from the first. The event became a humanitarian crisis, as many of these so-called Vietnamese boat people were put into peril as they hastily set sail on overcrowded boats and makeshift rafts. Many of these people hoped to arrive in the U.S. However, according to Thu Hong Ha, a journalist and Vietnam refugee, the American public's opposition to letting in Vietnamese refugees was even higher than today's opposition to Syrian asylum seekers. Despite this, there are now 1.3 million Vietnamese immigrants in America, and there are 300,000 children. Today, the reunited Vietnam is still communist. However, not as strict as countries like China. U.S.-Vietnamese relations have been improving since the war. In 1995, President Clinton normalized U.S.-Vietnamese relations, and in 2016, President Barack Obama visited Vietnam. In May of the same year, Vietnamese Prime Minister Nguyen Duong Phuc visited the U.S. to help strengthen relations. Despite this, the country does not share the same freedoms as America. In 2015, at least 40 people were beaten by assailants working with or hired by the Communist Party of Vietnam. All people involved in the beatings were never held accountable for their actions. The criminal justice system is under control by the government and is extremely problematic. Those who spoke out against the government have been thrown in jail or harassed by the police. Another big change from the Vietnam conflicts is the way America looks at their politicians. Vietnam veteran Carl Martinez, who served as a Marine lieutenant, said in his New York Times article, "People talked about Johnson's credibility gap. This was a gentle way of saying that the president was lying. Then, a credibility gap was considered unusual and bad. Now, it's just bad." In his words, we have switched from naivety to cynicism. The near-blind faith had in our politicians is gone. The Paris Peace Accords was a failed attempt to honorably bail out America from a conflict that its people were against. Because of the unclear war goals made by politicians and the lack of public support for the war in general, there was little hope for a peaceful compromise that would lead to an American victory. Despite the efforts made by people like Henry Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho, conflict was inevitable. Staff Sergeant Hassanat best summarized this saying, "Peace with honor? What a joke. We lost our honor at the end of World War II."